Hello, everyone. It is the recording for the December 7th electric lecture for physics or Math 100 class. So we're going to talk about electricity today. So let's go into it and get a little electric with it. So we're going to talk about a couple of concepts. We're going to talk about electricity concepts, human electricity, ions, current, fidelity, and some PT application of all of the above. That's kind of the overview. Let's get into the kind of thick of things here. So what is electricity? Well, it's a wide range of physical phenomena that underlie just about everything around us in one way or another, right? Lightning is an example of electricity. Sparks, atomic charge. Your phone has electricity, right? Electricity involves electric charges, right? We have a positive and a negative charge. Positives repel positives, negatives repel negatives, positive attracts negatives, and vice versa. So it's the same way of saying same charges repel, like charges, or sorry, same charges repel, opposite charges attract, right? So when we talk about it, we have to get down to the atomic level. We talked briefly about atoms back in the Makeup of Everything lecture, but the atoms themselves are composed of both positively charged nucleus surrounded by negatively charged electrons, hopefully in a balance that makes the atom neutral, right? Each of the electrons in any atom has the same quantity of negative charges and the same mass, right? So we have protons. They're the center positive charge. They're in the nucleus. They are positive electric charges. They do repel positive charges, but attract negatives. This is why there are the neutrons, which we'll talk about later down here in the nucleus, so that the protons don't just blow themselves apart, right? But interestingly enough, the protons themselves have about 1,800 times more mass than the electrons, but they possess equal charge, equal and opposite, obviously. But it's kind of wild when you think about that. The protons are, 1,800 times larger, but they provide the same charge as the smaller electron, right? Then we have the electrons that are orbiting the nucleus. They have negative electric charges. They do repel negatives, but attract positives, and that's where they get that gravitational pull to the nucleus from them. And then we have the neutrons, which help make up some of the mass of the actual atom, right? So here's kind of the layout of a general atom, right? In this case, we have 4 neutrons, 3 protons, 3 electrons. So when we talk about humans and electricity, the human nerve at rest, or the human neuron at rest, is slightly more negatively charged inside the space than outside the cell. Usually we say that a human nerve has a resting potential, so where it sits at normally is about -70 millivolts. What this does is allows for what's called propagation of nerve signals. And we're going to get into that a little bit more heavily next semester in anatomy, but this is going to be kind of a preview of what you're going to have to look at for next semester, right? So the positive ions flow towards the inside until the charge becomes more positive and pushes that charge down the field. So when the flow charge becomes less negative, right, so about -70, that allows the neuron to send the signal down the path. They call this depolarization of the nerve. And yes, before you ask, you do have to know all of this. Yes, this is why I teach you it now. So that I teach it now, it learns a little bit more in anatomy, and we cover it again in kinesiology because it's that important. Because we're going to talk about this even when we get into the vestibular system and the balance system. How the vestibular system operates is very similar to this. So we get a depolarization of the nerve. It fires off that action potential and sends the signal down the nerve. And you have to understand that happens every so many millimeters. So it happens rapidly down the line, right? And that's what's going to propagate that signal further and further down the nerve till it comes from your brain, goes out your hand to stick your finger up. All of that is propagation of a nerve signal. So what's happening is all along that process, if I've got my hand here, I send the signal, pull my finger up, -70 resting goes to -50. -50, -50, -50, -50, -50, all the way out, and then my finger goes up. It just happens so rapidly, we really can't detect it, right? After it fires off, the next thing that will happen is the nerve will then repolarize, and for a short period of time, not be able to send another signal. That's called hyperpolarization. That keeps that charge or that signal from backtracking down the nerve. It's going to prevent it from going anywhere. And then the nerve will eventually return to its -70 base status. So that's a lot of stuff, Mr. McKeever. Let's take a look at it. So this is what it looks like in the human nerve when something fires off. This is known as an action potential. An action potential happens whenever a nerve gets a signal sent down it. So in this case here, right, doesn't matter what nerve we're talking about, we'll just any nerve. We're sitting at this minus 70 millivolts. If nothing comes down that nerve, it'll just sit there at minus 70 the whole time and be perfectly fine. Now, if all of a sudden a signal comes down and says, hey, I've got a fire, well, a couple things can happen. If those signals never reach that minus 50, minus 55 degree threshold here, there'll be what's called failed initiations, meaning that nothing will happen. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes your nerves make the decision that this doesn't need to continue any further, so it stops at where it's at. If at the point where that signal reaches that minus 55, at that point, it's an all or nothing. It's going. So depolarization occurs, and the nerve becomes more positive. Sodium ions flow into the nerve and fill it up. They come in like gangbusters, like, hey, the party's here, right? The action potential moves down the nerve. Then the nerve will start repolarizing, right? So they realize that the nerve says, you know what, these sodium ions or these potassium ions, they don't need to be here. The bouncers come and kick them out. And so repolarization occurs. And then for a short period of time, like I said, this nerve comes down here and gets stuck in this hyperpolarized state. When it's in that hyperpolarized state, no amount of stimulus at all is going to allow those potentials to occur. It's just stuck down here. That prevents that signal from going backwards down the nerve. Eventually, repolarization will stabilize and it'll return back to that minus 70. Now, minus 70 is a guideline. It could be minus 75, it could be minus 65, could be minus 80, could be minus 60. But ideally, the threshold is somewhere around minus 50 to minus 55 millivolts in order to fire it off. Now, that threshold can change based upon these little things, the failed initiations or graded potentials. The more of these you get, this can actually move this up, so it's harder to initiate an action potential. And we'll go into that more in anatomy. So here's another picture of that human nerve cell, right? It has minus 70 millivolts. To generate an action potential, the nerve must depolarize, become more positive, right? Once the flow of the positive ions towards the negative ions is triggered, it'll continue until that balance inside the cell is more positive than the outside, and then the reverse will happen. We'll kick those positive ions out, and the nerve will go back to being a negative cell. So what I'm saying is, in general, people are negative people. In general, you are, right? In general, all of your nerves of your body are sitting at a negative state. So you weren't lying about your ex being a negative person. They were a negative person. We all are, right? Eventually, we have this flow where we sometimes do get more positive for a shortened period of time. But just like in life, that positivity only lasts so long that we go back to being negative. So how do we send those signals down? Well, we have these things called conductors and insulators, right? Conductors can transfer electrons more easily. When we look in the industrial world, copper is an excellent conductor of electricity. Most of your power cables, do I have a cable laying around here somewhere that I can easily access? Oh, there we go. A USB cable, right? Here's a USB cable. Inside this USB cable, I'm guessing, I can't confirm, it could be tin too, but I'm thinking this is not because this is a more high-end cable. This is a gaming cable. It's filled with really high conductive copper. That means the signal going down and back on this signal, right, conducts very well. On the outside of the cable, though, this is, and I know you can't see it very well, on the outside of my cable is this braided cabling cover, right? And it's an insulator. Inside, there's a small sheet of rubber, right? And then a little bit of plastic. And then there's this braidedness over it. And what that does is that keeps the flow inside of it. Thought I was going to sneeze. I did sneeze. There we go. That keeps the flow inside. If we didn't have this insulator on the outside of this cable, two things would happen. Every time you pick up the cable, you're going to get a jolt. The other thing is the electricity is going to escape. So your signal won't be as high quality. And we're going to talk about fidelity towards the end, right? So that means cables with a better insulator are going to transmit the signal better. Here, another great example. I've got cables all over the place. This cable is a cable meant for transmitting video over USB-C. As you can see, compared to that other cable, where'd that other cable go? It fell down here. This cable, really thin. This cable, really thick, right? This cable also has a much thicker insulation and it's not as pliable as that other cable, right? But this is designed so that I can send video across a USB-C connection. Video is going to require a little bit more conductance. So inside the material has got to be a little bit stabler, and it's also got to be protected from signal leakage going out around you, right? Well, your nerves are the same way. Your nerves, most of them are coated with a fatty cell called myelin, right? And myelin is a very, very protective coating. It's made of primarily of fat, right? It's created by Schwann cells, which you'll learn about. It insulates the neuron and assists with propagation of signals and making sure the signal is sent to the correct destination. The more myelin that nerve has, the quicker the conductivity of that signal. We also have this term in the real world, not in the human world, right? Called superconductors, right? Superconductors are materials that acquire zero resistance, meaning that you can send that signal down that thing and it'll never, ever bleed a little bit. It has zero resistance. It sends it rapidly down it. Silicone is an excellent example of superconductors, right? Which is why we have a lot of our chips made out of it. Once the electric current is established in the superconductor, the electrons flow indefinitely, and there's not a lot of resistance. With that no resistance, the current passes without losing energy, right? No heat loss occurs. That's why as phones become more and more advanced, right, we get better and better battery life because the current's not being resisted and maybe heating up or bleeding out of the phone. So here's back to that nerve, right? So this nerve here, here's our cell body of our nerve. Change the color, let's go red this time. Here's our cell body of the nerve, right? So that cell body gets a signal from another nerve. It says, okay, yep, I've got to send it down. So it's going to continually send it down this nerve. Well, this nerve is myelinated. That's what this stuff is on the outside, these fatty sheaths. The spaces between the myelination, these areas here, are called the nodes of Ranvier. And those nodes of Ranvier help send the signal faster because they allow for one area for those ions to pass in and out of. If you have one area where they can kind of gang bust in, it helps propagate it down the signal faster. All right, so the nodes of Ranvier are the splits between those myelin sheaths. And that's what allows, again, all these positive ions to flow in, and then when the conductance is over, for the positive ions to escape. Here's a little picture of it that's a little bit better, right? Or a little bit more childish drawing, right? Here's our cell body. Here's our myelin sheaths. And again, it says they're made out of Schwann cells. Schwann cells rebuild and tear them apart. We're going to talk about in neuro a condition called multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is a problem with the Schwann cells, where the Schwann cells, instead of building up the myelin, break it down. So maybe along this nerve, this chunk of myelin is taken out. What does that do to this nerve? Well, now the signal goes fast through here, gets slowed down here, and then speeds back up in the next section. That can cause delays in motion. It can cause hesitancy in motion. It can cause problems with thinking. A lot of patients that have MS talk about having kind of a fog. So there are all kinds of things that can happen if your myelin sheaths are not intact. Now, certain nerves don't have myelin, right? We talk about, when we look at the brain, we have white matter and we have gray matter. White matter is highly myelinated matter. Gray matter, not so myelinated. But that's okay, because in the brain, everything's close to where it needs to be, right? The further we get away from the brain, the more we need myelin to conduct that signal back and forth to the brain. So we talked about these nodes of Ranvier, the gaps in the myelin sheath. For a signal to travel down the membrane of an unmyelinated axon, change in the membrane potential must occur every square micrometer along the membrane. However, in a myelinated axon, these changes only need to occur at the gaps between the myelin. Right? This is called saltatory conduction. And if you want to click on that link there, there's a great video on it, done by a group that does science videos. I found it and it was really actually interesting. We're not going to watch it on stream here, obviously, but it's a really great video to help you kind of understand saltatory conduction. It allows for the highly conductive and insulation feature of myelin that allows the potential to literally jump from one node to the next. It's different from the way that electricity works powering your lights, but you can still use these ideas to understand each other, right? So if you flip a switch at your wall outlet to turn on the light, which I got a light on over here, that switch opens the circuit. That circuit starts sending a flow of electrons down to your outlet, right? In my case, I've got a switched outlet. That outlet then allows the electricity to flow down the cord of the light. Now, the light itself has a switch too. I leave my light switch on so that when I flick the light switch on, my light comes on. I could turn it off, and then that electricity gets to the end of that thing and dies. There's nowhere for it to go. And even at that point, if your lights are off, you still have a little bit of electricity bleed occurring somewhere in that line, right? So you're still losing a little bit of electricity there. Nowadays, though, with the LEDs, and we'll talk about that stuff in the future here, is that honestly, it's more, usually you lose more by turning the lights off and on than you do by just leaving them on. But that's beside the point. So that's the idea. Well, the cabling throughout the whole thing, right, is insulated. And that insulation is much like our myelin. It keeps the electricity inside the cable. The better the insulation, the less the electric bleed off. And the more efficient your devices are, meaning that if you have a really, really highly efficient cabling system in your house, you might not use as much electricity as someone like in my apartment here, where honestly, I looked at the wiring's from like 1955. Some of my wires in my wall actually don't even have any insulation on them, right? They're just bare copper wires, which don't even get me started on that. But when you've got that bare copper wire, some of the electricity is bleeding off, meaning that my electric bill is going to be a little bit more expensive than somebody that's got a really good insulation on your wires, right? And we're talking about gauges of wires and everything else like that as well. So this is kind of how it works with those, looking at the action potential combined with the nodes of Rambier, right? So as the charge spreads down the axon goes away from the cell, axon away. Axon goes away from the cell body, right? So again, we're going to go back to a picture of a cell here. Let me get my drawer up here. So here's my cell body, right? Here's my dendrites coming in, right? Dendrites are coming into the nerve. Here's my big, thick axon, right? Axon equals away. So that axon is what's conducting the signal away from the cell body up here of the nerve. So whenever you think of this again, think axon away. So when that cell body needs to send the signal down, right? That charge sends down that axon. Myelination via the Schwann shells prevent the ions from leaking out, just like preventing electricity from leaking out in a regular cable, right? The charge spreads unimpeded, meaning there's no resistance until it reaches a stretch of unmyelinated section called the nodes of Rambier, which is packed with sodium molecules, right? In this way, the electrical signal continues to jump down the axon faster and they can move down an unmyelinated cell. So it doesn't require as many swaps of the sodium potassium as it does if it's myelinated, right? Myelination provides a little bit more conductivity. You get that saltatory conduction. So the flow of electric charge, more specifically the flow of charged particles, right? We have electrons and electrical wiring. We have positive charged ions like fluids like car batteries or in the human body. All of that is the flow of charge. And the flow of charge is also known as the current. So your nerves have a certain current to them. And down here's a picture of the sodium potassium pump. I'm not going to go hard on this right now because this is going to be a big topic for anatomy. I think it's next semester. Don't quote me on it. You may have already gone over a little bit of it. And then it's going to be a big topic in kinesiology because we need to understand this in order to understand the way nerves work. So then we go from switching from the human body. Let's talk about some ions now. Sometimes atoms gain or lose electrons. It happens. Well, why is that? Well, because they're trying to make sure that outer shell of electrons is a stable outer shell. We talked about the number of electrons in those shells. And if they don't have enough, they'll either try to gain an electron or steal an electron from somewhere, right? So at the top of the picture here, we've got a sodium, we've got a chlorine atom. Sodium itself, if you look on that outer shell, only has a single electron out there, but the inner shell, we've got the 2, which is a full shell. We have the 8, which is a full shell, but that single electron out there doesn't like to be out there. And then we look over at the chlorine atom. It's got 2 on the inner shell, 8 on the second shell, and 7 on the final shell. So it's almost a complete atom. And it's like, man, if I could just get 1 more electron, I'd feel a lot better. And sodium comes along and goes, nah, man, here you go. Tosses its electron into it. So then by that, they combine together to form salt, sodium chloride, right? But in that way, you have a sodium ion now and a chlorine ion. One's a positive charge, one's a negative charge. They bind together, right? One has lost an electron, one has gained an electron. So one's going to become more positive, one's going to become more negative. So the atom that loses or gains a negative charge will be called an ion. So we can have a positive ion or we can have a negative ion. Right, so a positive ion occurs when an atom loses an electron charge. At that point, it has more protons than electrons, and it's attracted to the negative pole. The negative pole of anything is called a cathode. Right, so if you have a battery, the negative pole is the cathode. The negative pole is going to attract cations. This is where it gets confusing because the pole is negative, but the cation is a positive. Then you have the negative ion occurs when an atom gains an electron, a negative charge, right? Then it'll have more electrons than protons, and it becomes a negatively charged ion. It'll be attracted to the positive pole, the anode, and therefore it's an anion. So if you're ever forgetting which is more negative and which is more positive, well, think about cats. Cats can have a very negative attitude, therefore the cathode on the poles is negative, but it's going to attract the cations, which are positive, because opposites attract, right? Relationship among electrical forces and distance are discovered by Charles Coulomb in the 18th century, right? He states that for a pair of charged objects that are much smaller than the distance between them, the force between them varies directly and as the product of their charges and inversely as the square of the separation of the distance. Wow, that's a lot of stuff, Mr. McKeever. Right, well, I'm not going to make you remember Coulomb's law, don't worry. Right, but the important part of this is he established if the charges are alike in sign, the force is repelling. If the charges are not alike, the force is attractive. And discovered when he came up with this, he said the unit of charge is a coulomb. This is how much those items like to track back to each other, right? This is a lot like Newton's law of gravitation for masses, meaning that a larger item will obviously have a larger gravitational pull. It's the underlying bonding force between molecules. So what you need to know about a coulomb is it's a unit of charge that determines how things are more likely to be attracted to each other, right? So the greater the attraction force, being negative and positive, the greater the attraction. So just some funniness here. I'm not angry, I'm happiness challenged. Just thought these pictures would be great. My favorite is the one over there with the hammer. Some people need a high five in the face with a hammer. This just shows you that cats are more negative. And rip poor old tartar sauce. That's the name of this cat. Grumpy Cat actually had a name. It was she, and her name was Tartar Sauce, but unfortunately she passed away a few years ago. There's actually a great picture of Grumpy Cat with Stan Lee, and that picture should probably be in the National Archives somewhere at this point. Just joking. So some common ions in the human body. Well, we have sodium, which is a positive. We have potassium, calcium, and then we have chlorine. Right? So those are some common ions in the human body. Sodium being positive means it's lost some electrons. Potassium being positive means it's lost some electrons. Calcium, same thing. Chlorine being negative means it's stolen some electrons. An interesting thing is that chlorine can bond with all of the 3 above molecules. So it can bind with sodium, can bind with potassium, can bind with calcium, calcium chloride, potassium chloride, sodium chloride, all of which are salts in the human body. Then we're going to talk about iontophoresis, right? Iontophoresis is the transdermal delivery of medication using electricity. That will come up when we get to the end of the lecture here, right? But when we use medications, we talked about this briefly before, these medications have different charges, right? So like acetic acid is a negative charge. Lidocaine, zinc oxide, and hydrocortisone are some of our more positive ones, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, when we're, putting those pads on the patient, we'll talk about this in a little bit, right? So we have our negative pad and we have our positive pad. If I'm giving the patient acetic acid, because it's a negative pad, I've got to apply it to the negative pad. That is going to repel it. It's going to push that medication into me. If I'm smart, let's say this is my arm. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a really poorly drawn arm. Put one pad on this side, that'll drive the medication in. If I put the positive pad on the other side, it'll attract the medication. And therefore, it uses the ionic charge to deliver the medication. Iontophoresis, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the application of electricity in physical therapy. So charge only occurs when pushed or driven to do so. In order to sustain a charge flow, some sort of pumping device is needed. In the human body, we have the sodium-potassium pumps, which are the pumps that are going to push positive and negative or positive ions in along the nerve in order to pull kind of that charge down the ion or the nerve. Flow is also called current. So the amount that charge going down our nerves is a current, right? Again, positive flows towards negative, negative flows towards positive. You're going to see that repetitively here. We measure currents in units called amperes or amps, named for the scientist that first described them, André Ampère, right? The unit for measurement for electric potential to be able is called a volt, right? Therefore, electric potential is sometimes called voltage. It's caused when a separation is created between charges, creating the tendency to flow. So when you think of something like a 9-volt battery, it's talking about the potential for the charges to flow from negative to positive or positive to negative. The greater the separation, the higher potential for the greater voltage, right? So the greater the separation in charge, the greater the chance for the voltage to flow. And when it flows, it's going to be the current then. So if you just have a 9-volt battery just sitting there, there's no current in it. Let's say you pick that 9-volt battery up and touch it to your tongue. At that point, when you complete the circuit between the negative and positive poles, a current is going to flow from one pole to the other. It's going to go through your tongue and you get, there's that, right? That's the flow of electricity. Now, we also have that flow and we have the voltage, right? But we also have resistance. Resistance is the pushback force, right? It's what resists or doesn't allow it to flow, but it's actually energy in general, movement in general, anything, resistance, right? When we lift a weight, that is our resistance. So when an arrow is fired, the molecules in the air resist the arrow, right? And eventually, if we just fired it off into space, it wouldn't keep going forever. It'll eventually stop and drop down. The resistance of the air molecules to that arrow. When blood flows through the arteries, the length of the vessels and the compliance or ability to expand and contract affect the resistance. We call that peripheral resistance. But resistance is the pushback force. Same example, if I take that battery and stick it to my tongue. When I stick it to my tongue, if my tongue is dry and cakey, the tongue has, I don't know why it would be dry and cakey, but if it is, the tongue will have a greater resistance to that flow, and maybe I won't get shocked as much. But if my mouth is moist, moist is a great term. We're going to use that in wound care quite a bit. And my tongue is pliable, meaning it's able to shape and it's more elastic, that current will travel faster. Well, how can I make that even travel even faster? What if I put a piece of metal wire over the positive, negative, and then touch that metal wire to my tongue? I've increased the flow at that point. The resistance has been reduced, right? And I'm going to get more of a shock. So resistance or impedance is measured in a unit called ohms. Rather than using an O for George Ohm, who came up with it, we used the Greek symbol omega in order to stop confusing with the symbol for zero. There's a little known fact. George Ohm was the first Borg sent back in time to start the assimilation of the human race, right? Because he proved us that resistance is futile. Okay, so like one of you in this class will get that joke. Well, how do we reduce resistance? Well, we can reduce the length of a cable, right? The shorter the length, the less the chance of the signal to fade, right? And we can talk about this in the form of like USB cables, right? If you want to charge your phone faster, have a shorter cable, right? how can you overcome the length? We can have an intensity of the signal at the output, right? Some of our chargers, do I have one of my really powerful chargers sitting in here somewhere? I think I do. It's not one of those. Yeah, it is. So like this charger here, right? This charger has a greater output, right? It has a higher amperage, ability to conduct current. So therefore, the length of the cable really doesn't matter as much at this point because this puts out a ton of amperage. Did I have any of my cheap chargers over here? I went out before I started this on. It would have made sense. Nope, I don't have one of my cheap chargers over here. Oh, well. Anyway, so if I use a less amperage charger, it's going to require a shorter length to charge as fast, right? Or a beefier conduit, thicker wire. And that's where the diameter comes into play, right? The signal needs a conduit robust enough to carry it, meaning a nice thick wire. So the larger the diameter of the wire, the better it's going to travel. The shorter the wire, the better it's going to travel. It's going to reduce resistance. So what determines resistance? Material of the circuit, length of the circuit, cross-sectional area of the circuit, temperature of the circuit, right? Because certain temperatures allow signals to transmit faster. We know that in the human body, in the brain transmits signals a little bit faster if it's cooler. But the rest of the human body transmits signals a little bit faster if it's warmer. So if you can have a cool brain and a warm body, that's the most optimal way to transmit signals, right? That's why when we start sweating, what's one of the first areas that starts sweating is usually our brow, right? It's trying to cool down the brain a little bit. So impedance is the resistance to the flow. Conductance is the ease at which its current flows along the medium. And capacitance is nothing more than the battery, right? The ability to store the electrical charge. So Ohm's law comes into play here. Ohm's law is a relationship between voltage, current, and resistance. So Ohm's law states that current, which we use the letter I for because C is used for something else, I equals voltage over resistance. So I equals VR. You do have to know this formula because we need to know this for modalities next semester. So therefore, the amperes equals the volts over the ohms. So for an example here, 120 volts with a 10 ohm resistance would be 12 amps. So what happens to our human body if we get shocked? Well, there's lots of things that can happen, right? We can overheat our tissue. We can disrupt nerve function, right? Your hand can get all twisted up. You can upset heart electrical patterns or reset heart electrical patterns, right? You can upset the nerve center that controls breathing. We can actually affect autonomic dysfunction, right? I'm going to use this as an example. So when I went in for my neck surgery, for my anterior surgery, something happened and they ended up nicking my vagus nerve. Because they did that, it sent me into cardiac arrest. Well, how did they fix that? They shocked me, right? They got out the paddles, clear, bam. When I came to in the recovery room, I'm laying in the recovery room going, why do I feel like I got hit by a Mack truck? Like literally, I didn't even care about the surgical opening of my neck and the plate being put in there now. My whole body felt like just like I got run over. Well, what happened is when they shocked me, that signal conducted throughout my whole body and all my muscles went into tetany for a short period of time, right? That caused disrupt the normal nerve function. So at that point, my nerves were just like, nope, I'm tired, forget it. And I was really sore. But the good news is because they did that, my heart flow was restored, which meant I was still alive and I'm still here to teach you today. So that's kind of how electricity can be both good and bad. I mean, it's restarted my heart and got my heart kind of jump started, right? It's just like jump starting a car, very similar at least. But the downside to it was it caused some damage and disruption to my normal nerve function and the rest of my body for a time period. And also made me a little bit foggy as well. Right, so here's kind of looking at the current in milliamps. So electrical shock, to prevent this, there must be a difference in electric potential between the two parts of the body. Right, the current, the higher the current, the greater the risk of electrical shock. Current can be increased by either increasing the voltage or decreasing the resistance, right? So the current on the far side is milliamps. So where's my little charger at again here? This charger is it's got it listed somewhere. It doesn't list it anymore. That's pretty impressive. Oh, no, there it is. It's in gray writing. Oh, there it is. This is a 15 milliamp charger, right? So, or 15 amp charger. So this current can actually affect me 15 milliamps, right? If I was to attach a bare wire to this and grab a hold of it, I would be in that region where I may not be able to let go of that bare wire on this charger, right? Under 10 milliamps, you just can feel it. It's a little bit uncomfortable, right? We get up into that 20 to 50 milliamps is severe pain, right? Then we get down into those lower ranges and we probably end up fatal, right? So how do we affect this current? Well, that means that voltage isn't necessarily the only thing that's the problem here, right? Because remember, I equals VR. Current is the important thing for the shock. We could have a 300 volt item, but if we have a 300 ohm resistor on it, that means the current's only going to be 1 milliamp. If I come in here and change that, so 1 milliamp, we just barely feel it. If I come here and change that and say, take that away, now we're at a 10 milliamp charge, right? That means we can't let it go. I come in here, delete one more and say it's a 3 ohm resistor. Well, now we're in trouble because now we're at 100 milliamps and that's dangerous, right? So the voltage hasn't changed at all. The resistance has. Well, what else can I change? Well, how about instead of, yes, we'll leave this as 300 down here. What if I change this to 3000 and up my voltage? Now it's increased, right? Or I could also come in here and what if I just delete both these and now have a 3 volt over a 300 resistance to reduce the milliamps. So that comes into play. So current is more important to us when we're talking about electrical shock than necessarily the voltage. You can have a high volt wire, but if the resistance is high, like say you have one of those high tension power wires outside and you reach up and you grab a hold of one of those. Well, as long as they have the right insulator on them, you're not going to get a shock. Cut a little hole in it and grab a hold of it, bad. Walk up to an electric fence, right? Grab a hold of it, right? It's going to hurt. If you now have leather gloves on your hand, it still may get into you. You may still get a little bit of a shock, but the shock's not going to be as great because those leather gloves are going to act as an increased resistor to reduce the current. So what if you need to get over an electric fence? Well, the object to get over the electric fence then would be to put as many layers over that fence to provide an increased resistance to decrease the current in you, right? So put a towel over it, maybe come up with the layers, take your shirt off, lay your shirt over it, whatever you need to do, that can reduce or increase the resistance, and therefore reduce the current. And the current's the important part. So which shock would be more dangerous here? A 20 volt with resistance of 1 ohm, a 200 volt with a resistance of 10 ohms, or 2 volt with a resistance of 0.1 ohms? Trick question. Guess what? They're all the same current. So that point doesn't matter. If we increase the resistance, though, without increasing the voltage, the shock will decrease. So if we go from a 20 volt with 1 ohm to a 20 volt with 20 ohms, we've reduced the current. Therefore, that's going to decrease the shock to us, right? Or if we decrease the voltage without increasing the resistance, that can also do the same thing. So our normal household circuit, right, that we operate on here in the United States is 110 volts of alternating current. We're going to talk about alternating current in a little bit. That doesn't really tell us much. What we need to know is how fast will this flow into us? We need to know our amperage, right? So just grabbing a 110 volt wire doesn't mean you're necessarily going to die. But if you have 110 volt ampere wire or 110 volt wire with 0 resistance, or actually you can't have zero, so 1 resistance, you're going to get 110 amps flowing into your body, and that could kill you, right? It'll probably stop your heart. So that's why it's important when you're dealing with electricity to be properly grounded. Right? When I'm working on computers and stuff like that, especially if I'm working on those old CRT monitors. So if you ever want to see something, Google, there's videos on people discharging those big old CRT monitors. Those monitors have a huge capacitance to store electricity. And if you're not careful when you're working on them and you get into where that capacitance is stored, you can get a huge current flowing through your body that could actually kill you. And there are great videos of people discharging it, electricity everywhere. It's kind of cool, right? But when I'm working on computers, I have a wrist strap that I attach to a ground where the electricity goes into that rather than through me, right? In the case of this person here, if he grabs this wire, right? When he grabs that wire, it's going to go into him. Now that electricity has to leave somewhere. In this case, it looks like he's wearing rubber boots. So that electricity can't go out that way. So there are two options for the electricity to leave him: out his head and out his hand, back into the air. So it's going to choose the least resistive way. More than likely, it's going to go out his hand. And there's a chance that hand could be blown off, literally explode from the electric power. There's been stories of people's heads literally popping from electricity, right? But the ground here, the resistance of his boots are going to prevent him from doing it. Now, what if he wore rubber gloves? Now he's got some rubber gloves on. Well, now he's got resistance upped. So there's likely he might not get shocked, right? That's why when you see people work on electric lines, a lot of times they have those big, huge, thick gloves on. And it's not because they want to look cool and tough. It's because they're trying to prevent that electrical shock. They're reducing the current going into their body. So fidelity comes into play here, right? Fidelity from the Latin term meaning being faithful, right? If you've ever seen the Marines have a phrase called semper fidelis, right? Or semper fi, meaning always faithful. Well, fidelity talks about how high of a quality of cable you have in your house, right? A higher fidelity cable is going to conduct electricity and prevent bleed off as well, right? Larger diameter cables that are short provide the most faithful transmission. Some of the very first record players were called hi-fi for this very reason, meaning they were able to transmit that sound a lot more effectively. And even in today's world, we have Wi-Fi, wireless fidelity, in which the same way, right? Instead of transmitting through wires, is now transmitting through the air, right? And we've learned transmitting an electrical signal through the air is hard, right? We could increase the moisture in the house, and that would actually increase the signal transfer, right? In here in Nevada, because we're so dry, Wi-Fi doesn't transmit as well as it would maybe somewhere on the East Coast where our humidity is up. So some talking about fidelity, so let's talk about some more wire knowledge that you never wish you knew. Wires are typically rated in gauge sizes, and we're not talking about ears, right? Those ear things that are weird. Sorry if you have them, they're just weird. So wires are rated in these gauge sizes. They're reverse scale, where the smaller the scale, the thicker the wire, right? So when we look down here, a 10 gauge is about 2.5 millimeters, right? And we go all the way down to a 28 gauge, which is 0.321 millimeters. So which would provide less resistance? Long, low gauge wires or short, high gauge wires? Well, it would depend. They would both provide a certain fidelity. The best would be a short, long, or high gauge wire, right? Something that's thick would provide the most fidelity, the most efficient transfer, right? And I talked about that with wherever I threw that cable at. I threw it on the floor down here, right? This cable has a higher gauge than some of my other cables because the goal of this cable is to send a signal that is more faithful to the original source. You may have had this in your house. Maybe you went and you bought a brand new TV, right? And you had previously had all your stuff connected via AV cables, right? The red, yellow, white cables, right? Those are the colors, I think, yes. And now your TV's got HDMI, right? Ooh. Well, now you got to switch cables. Well, why is that? Well, the cable that you're getting, the HDMI cable, has a higher fidelity than those other types of cables. Audio can be transmitted by copper wiring or light, right? They can even use something, and if you've ever seen those, the little clear fiber optic cables that light up. Some of the higher end machines like my PlayStation 5 and my PS4 have an optical output for sound. I can connect an optical cable and that can transmit sound to something like a headset or a receiver with a lot greater quality because it's reduced the resistance. Again, that's all about that fidelity or the faithfulness of the signal. So let's talk about AC/DC, not the band, right? Although you might get thunderstruck from this lesson. All right. AC and DC is talking about the current. And actually, believe it or not, if you ever read how they came up with their name, They were one day trying to come up with a name and they couldn't come up with it. And one of their band members saw a chord and saw it said AC/DC. And they're like, hey, it sounds like a cool name. So AC/DC, alternating current, direct current. Alternating current is the current that flows in one direction, then changes directions repeatedly, right? This is our typical outlets in our homes. DC, right, is a current that only flows in one direction, right? Much like the band. So let me see here. Ah, there we go. There is a DC battery, right? I know you can't barely see it. There we go, right? That's a DC battery. This is for watches, right? Your normal batteries that you have in your home, those are DC batteries. They're a direct current. The current only flows in one direction, right? So that means alternating current is going to go forward and back, forward and back, forward and back rapidly, right? And it's going to depend upon how fast it alternates. And direct current is just going to flow, right? A 9-volt battery is just going to flow in one direction. So here in the United States or North America, current is chosen by AC. It's on a 60 cycles per second, meaning it changes 60 times per second. That's pretty freaking fast. The voltage is 110 or 120 volts here, right? Power transmission is more efficient at higher voltage. This is why Europe has adapted to 20 voltage, which is why if you go to Europe, you have to have one of those adapters. And I've got one somewhere, I don't know where it's at, somewhere over here. But it allows you to adapt so that you plug your normal cord in, you can plug it in without things blowing up. Because think about it. The voltage in the US is 120. The voltage in Europe is 220. If you don't change the resistance, which is what that adapter will do, your device will literally explode, right? Well, why did the US stay with 120 volts? It's really inefficient, like super duper Cooper inefficient. Europe was smart and said, we need to do 220 and it's just adapt that as its standard. The US like, nope, we're going to stay with 120. Just like we stay with the freaking universal, what do you call it, feet and all that crap, right? Well, we stay with it because there's so much more equipment already installed at 120. Could we convert to it eventually? It's a high possibility, right? And if we did convert to it, it would require major changes to most households, but it would make things more efficient. And therefore we would have less bleed off, and therefore we'd use less electricity, which in the long run, that would be better, wouldn't it? But let's say you have something plugged into the wall. It's going to convert the AC to DC, right? So the household current's AC, but the current in my laptop sitting here is DC, or the current in my computer sitting beside my laptop is DC. There's going to be a converter that's called a diode, a tiny electric device that acts as a one-way valve that allows electrons to only flow in one direction. So it stops that alternating current and sends them all in one direction to power my laptop and also to charge my battery in my laptop, right? Now, if that current is too great, it can actually heat up my laptop. That's why all laptops have a certain voltage adapter, right? My laptop here has a 110 volt adapter. My more portable laptop only has a 60 volt adapter. If I plug my 110 into that, I can actually overcharge the battery and cause it to bloat and cause damage to my laptop. So that's why it's important when you're getting stuff like new battery chargers or stuff like that for your phone to make sure you understand what your phone is rated for before you just go off and buy the most powerful charger in the whole wide world. That little black charger I showed you here, if I plug that into my old iPhone 4, there's a chance I could damage the iPhone 4 because it doesn't have necessarily protection for it. New phones have greater protections that kind of step down that voltage so it protects your batteries of your phone, right? And also has new technology where the battery will stop charging after a certain while and start to do what's called trickle charging. That's beside the point. So some misconceptions about electrical current. Electrical outlets in the walls of the home are the source of electrons. Nope, not true. The outlets are in the home are AC. The electrons make no net migration in through a wire in the AC circuit. When you plug in a lamp to the outlet, the electricity flows from the outlet into the lamp, not the electrons. Energy is carried by the pulsing electric field and causes vibratory motion. The electrical company sells us the energy. You provide the electrons. They sell the push. You have the electrons already, right? So that electric power is the rate at which energy is converted in forms, right? When we talk about power, we talk about power equals current, right? Transmission times voltage. We talk about the power in the term of watts. And that's what you're billed at from Nevada Energy in this area, right? Where it bills you for the amount of watts you use every month. Lately, though, because we've all been home more, our wattage usage has gone up. because we've been sitting around at home and have our lights on more frequently, or like me, have my full system set up here turned on more frequently. So my wattage has gone up. And therefore my electric bill has been a little bit more expensive, right? During summer, when it's really hot here and we use use air conditioning, we're using more power, therefore we get billed more for it. So CFLs, we talked a little bit about these before, right? We had the old incandescent bulbs before. Those are the old style with the little filament inside of them, right? Unfortunately, incandescent bulbs dissipate most of their energy in the forms of heat, right? So they let off a lot of heat. Therefore, they're not inefficient, or they're not very energy efficient. Fluorescent lamps, on the other hand, emit less heat. Why? Because they have a fluorescent gas inside of them that lights up rather than that single little wire that heats up, right? CFLs are a type of fluorescent lamp that fits into a standard light bulb socket. We used to have these, right? For the same wattage, CFLs emit much greater amounts of light and much less heat than incandescent bulbs. So therefore, you have a double whammy there, right? You're able to get more light out of that little tiny, if you look, that's a 13-watt Sylvania bulb down there, right? Versus maybe you had to have a 60-watt bulb that was incandescent to produce the same amount of light. So 13 watts is going to use a lot less power. The other positive of that is it didn't release as much heat. And because it didn't release as much heat, you didn't have to cool the area as much. So therefore you saved electricity, right? So that was the first. We started with CFLs to start, right? We've always had fluorescent lamps. Fluorescent lamps have just been always in like warehouses and stuff like that, those big old honking white bars. If you look, this is nothing more than one of those big old white bars kind of helically wrapped around something. And then we got LEDs, light-emitting diodes. This is another light source that are even more long-lasting, right? It's the light-emitting diode. The most primitive being the little red light to tell you whether your stereo is on or off, right? On your phone, when you get that little blinking light that tells you you've got a text message, your screen a lot of times has all kinds of LEDs on it, right? What else do I have here? Actually, my whole freaking desk is LEDs. Maybe one day when I clean up the wiring, I'll show you, but my whole desk is lit up in purple. I've got my cabling's all purple, my mouse pad's purple. I am pretty much the epitome of RGB gaming here, right? Red, green, blue. But all of those are LEDs. I can leave my whole setup here on for a long period of time and it barely uses any electricity. Now the laptop does, obviously, not screens, but the actual LED light up on my desktop, nothing at all. The LEDs I have backlighting my thing, right? So I can take my little controller, where's my controller at? I can take my little controller and I can make them do fancy things like, let's see, is it gonna work today? Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Come on, guys, work. There we go. Now I can make my lights kind of jump around. Oh, there we go. You can barely see it because I've got the light on over here. But my lights are kind of flashing, right? I can. There we go. Now we got the strobe effect going on here, right? I've got my whole screens backlit by LEDs because it makes it easier to see the screen then, right? That's going to drive me nuts. We're not going to be able to last for that long. Go away. Back to solid. Cooperate. There we go. Between CFLs and LEDs, those common use incandescent bulbs are going to be history soon. It's just the way it is, right? You know, your old Christmas lights used to be a form of incandescent lights. If you actually felt the old Christmas lights, they got really hot, right? And they could actually start fires. They got that hot. I remember I had a crazy uncle who decided he was going to put 1,000 light bulbs on his Christmas tree, and it caught fire. True story. Well, why was it? Because they was using the old form of light bulbs that had that little conductor inside of it, and those things heat up really bad. And he put 1,000 of them on a small Christmas tree, and well, disaster soon struck after that. But now most of our Christmas lights are LEDs, right? And they're able to glow brighter and use less electricity, so you feel a little bit less guilty about lighting up your Christmas tree year round. I've got an old style desk Christmas tree somewhere over here. I don't know where it's at, over my mess over there, that my mom had. I converted it. It originally was filled with like 100 of those stupid little light bulbs that were Christmas lights that were the old incandescent bulbs. I've now replaced them almost all with LEDs, but I had to make some wiring changes inside in order for the LEDs to work properly because it's not the same kind of wiring. You guys may think about it with your car, right? Some of your cars have old style incandescent bulbs in the headlights, whereas new cars are now coming with LED lights. Well, why are they coming with LED lights? Well, they're brighter, right? Sometimes too bright. And the other thing is they last longer, right? It's less chance of you having to replace the bulb as often. I remember my old halogen headlights, which are a form of CFLs. You know, you touch the glass of those with your bare hands, you actually can damage them and they'll die faster. LEDs are a little bit better about that. So we talked about AC in current homes, right? We've measured in RMS voltage, 120 VAC, right? Voltage at alternating current. Voltage is usually about 0.707 times the peak voltage, or conversely, the peak voltage about 1.4 times the RMS voltage. What does that mean? Well, that means that not necessarily RMS, right, is kind of the average of your voltage. The peak is how much voltage you can normally put out. So in your home, you can have a peak voltage of 170 volts, right? But your RMS, that average that's going to be is about 120 volts, right? Your outlet does not actually work like this. Instead, it excites all the electrons simultaneously, right? Everything is electrons. So the current excites the one thing that's already there. It doesn't fill up space like pouring water through a hose. There's already electrons in the wiring of your household. All it does is it drives them. It starts the flow going. So let's talk about circuits real quick. So we're going to talk about series and parallel. So what does a series circuit look like? It has a single path, current is the same through all the devices, and total resistance is the sum of the individual device resistances. Parallel circuits, and we're going to relate this to Christmas lights because it's the easiest way to think about it. Parallel circuit, what does a parallel circuit look like? Current has different paths, the current divides between the branches, and the total current is the sum of each branch's current. Resistance decreases with each branch added. So here's typical series and here's typical parallel, right? So with a series connection, right, it can flow this way and only this way, because that positive is going to be pulled over here towards that negative. That's the only way that current can flow, right? And this one over here, as the positive leaves, it gets to this branch here and it can go 3 different ways. So a parallel connection has multiple things connected in parallel to each other. Series means everything is in a series with one another.
I didn't get that.
I wasn't talking to you. I knew she was going to talk. So when we're talking about a series circuit, the number of resistors, the light bulbs, increase the brightness of the bulbs. Of each of the bulbs decreases. Okay, the brightness of the bulbs decreases as we add light bulbs because the resistance of the overall circuit increases. So as we add bulbs, which will become resistors, the overall brightness will decrease. If you remove one of the bulbs, circuit no longer is complete, and therefore the bulbs will go out. This is the old school Christmas lights, right? So here we have 3 bulbs on one circuit. If this light blows, pop. There's the old phrase, one light goes out, they all go out. That's exactly what happens. Now, all these light bulbs go out, right? And usually now you got to figure out what light bulb blew, because it may be this one, but it could also be this one. Well, because if this one pops, you still can't get current because the signal's interrupted right there, right? So if one light goes out, they all go out type idea. That would be bad if our house was set up that way, right? If all of our electricity, right? Let's just draw. So we've got a house here, right? Here's our kitchen. Here's our dining room. Here's our living room. And maybe here's a bedroom. If when that cabling came in our house, right, it came in through the kitchen, ran through the kitchen to the dining room, from the dining room to the bedroom, and the bedroom to the living room. And it was all on one single series. If a light goes out in the bedroom, right, that would actually kill all the power in the whole house. So good thing is our houses aren't set up that way, or that would be a big problem, right? Parallel is the more common way. Parallel is the number of resistors, light bulbs increases, the brightness of the bulb increases, right? Because the circuit of current has multiple paths to travel to arrive at the indicator bulb. So in this case here, we're going to put an indicator bulb down here to tell us how the current's flowing, right? So we got an indicator bulb down here. So this is only one. one resistor. Now we had two resistors, but the path has two different ways to travel. This indicator bulb is going to get brighter. We had 3, because we've increased the resistance, right? That's going to go up. But the problem is this electricity has multiple paths to get here. So overall, you're not going to lose brightness where you were with the series connection. Right? This is how we talk about safety fuses, right? Safety fuses and circuit breakers. Safety fuses are wires that melt when a given current is exceeded. You have these in your car, right? You have a fuse box inside your car. You may even have a fuse box in your old homes. Most of those have been replaced with circuit breakers now because it's cheaper. So let's say your fuse blows for your headlights because the current, for whatever reason, at that given moment went too high. Well, inside this little fuse here, which is the one down here in the left corner, there's this wire, right? And this wire melts. Now that circuit's closed, right? So that series is now shut off. You don't get your headlights until you replace that fuse. I just had that with my Versa down in Tucson. I couldn't figure out why my headlights weren't coming on. And I checked everything, cables were right. And I'm like, oh, fuses. I checked my fuse. Sure enough, my fuse for my battery, or my headlights blew. And why did it blow? It's probably because it's like 14 years old, honestly. So check your fuses regularly. Circuit breakers are a little different, right? They're an automatic switch that turns off when current is excessive, right? Especially happens a lot during summer when all of the air conditionings are on in a building. The current might get way too excessive and suddenly the circuit breaker will trip, right? And that's when that circuit breaker flips and you got to go flip it back, right? Do you ever have that when you're in your kitchen, you have too much stuff plugged into the kitchen and all of a sudden everything shuts down in the kitchen? Like, I tripped the circuit. So you got to go back and flip the switch, right? My circuit breaker is right behind me in that closet behind me. And I had to remember not to bury it so I could get access to it. So electric energy storage can be stored in a thing called a capacitor. Right, simplest capacitor is a pair of conducting plates separated by a small distance, but not touching each other. When these plates are connected to a charging device, such as a battery, electrons are transferred from one plate to the other. This occurs as the positive battery terminal pulls electrons from the plate connected to it. These electrons, in effect, are pumped through the battery through the negative terminal to the opposite plate. The capacitor plates then have an equal and opposite charge. Positive plates connect to the positive terminal, negative plate connected to the negative terminal. When the charging process is complete, when the potential difference between the plates equals the potential difference between the battery terminals, right? We talked about you have these batteries in your car, you have batteries in your phones, you have batteries pretty much in everything nowadays, right? Even my computer has 2 different batteries in it because it has a battery for allowing me to operate mobily and has a battery for maintaining the information on my computer, right? The BIOS, which is what it's called, a BIOS battery. The greater the battery voltage, the larger and closer the plates, the greater the charge can be stored, right? Energy can be stored in a capacitor comes from the work required to change it. Discharging a capacitor can be a shocking experience if you happen to be on the conducting path. Did anyone ever try to jumpstart a battery and accidentally touch the red and the black cables together, right? You get that nice spark going on. That's discharging your battery. You're actually losing some voltage by doing that. So why then is it better to jumpstart a car while your car is running? Well, if you don't have your car running, you're leeching off some of that power in your battery. And therefore, what's going to happen is your battery is going to die. And then you jumpstarted someone else's car, their car starts, they're off and running, now your car's dead. So make sure if you're jumpstarting your car is running before you do it. And if your car is running, you better go catch it. So how does this all apply to physical therapy? Well, that's a great question, Mr. McKeever. Let's talk about it, Mr. McKeever. That's great. There are essentially 3 main types of electrical stimulation that we're going to deal with in physical therapy. There are more versions, but these are the most common. We have TENS, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. It's a pain relief theory, right? It's most commonly administered in battery-powered devices, where it can employ as needed, PRN, for time periods ranging from as little as 30 minutes to 24/7. And we're going to learn the actual parameters behind it next semester. I'm not going to try to teach you them this semester. We have NMES, neuromuscular electrical stimulation. This is where electricity is used to facilitate a muscular contraction. There are various types of NMES, including Russian, VMS, and BINS. Most patients do not like NMES because it's a little uncomfortable. They get their body's getting shocked to contract, right? And then we have what's called IFC, interferential or interference current electrical stimulation. And what does IFC do? Well, IFC is also pre-mod IFC. It's another term we'll talk about next semester. It's used for pain relief, by creating an interference to those areas. It actually interrupts the pain current, right? The electrical current may also be used to administer medication, right? Iontophoresis, and also for wound care. So pain relief, push medication, stimulate neuromuscular action, wound healing, edema control, all of those are possibilities, right? So this lady up here in the upper right, that's a TENS unit. Here we have an Ionto unit. I'm guessing probably here we're using Russian just by looking at that. And here's the typical E-stim machine. We're going to use one of these next semester. And we see we got IFC, we have pre-mod. High volt we'll talk about next semester. Don't worry about that so much. And then we've got Russian, right? And I always joke about in E-stim, Russian moves you, because Russian is the stim that's going to cause you to contract muscles. Here's some Bioness units, right? So the Bioness is the company that makes them. What these units do is these allow for patients that are missing certain motions of their body to compensate for them. This one up here in the upper right is a muscle or control unit that goes on your tibialis anterior to improve dorsiflexion. So that goes around your lower calf. There's a little pad in here that goes right on tibialis anterior. And then this pad goes down under your foot. And what it does is that when it detects that your foot's picking up off the ground, it will cause a shock to cause your tibialis anterior to dorsiflex your foot. And allows patients to have normal foot motion when they have something like foot drop. This one down here in the corner is for wrist drop. So this is patients that can't extend their wrist. This unit has a little sensor in the palm that when the patient wants to do a specific thing, they turn their hand a specific way. And when they do, it triggers that system and it causes the wrist to go back into extension. So I can maybe do something like grabbing a hold of something and extend back and hold it, because now I've got extension. And then I forget how exactly they work, but I think if you radially deviate, then it releases the E-stim. But those units allow for patients to have motion that they may have lost due to nerve damage, which is actually really cool, right? We're starting to get to the point where we almost can have a whole spinal suit of a patient being able to walk that may not have been able to walk due to a spinal cord injury. Wound care. We can use E-stim by firing off the body's bioelectric system and activate things at a cellular level. This phrase will come into play a lot when we talk about modalities next semester, because a lot of patients will say, well, I'm not feeling it. Well, your answer is going to be, well, that's okay. It's working at the cellular level. Because patients may not feel it, right? By using E-stim, we can trigger growth cells to help facilitate collagen laying down, and that lays scaffolding down over the wound. It can help heal it. We can also use it to reduce edema in the wound. So here we've got a couple different wounds, right? We've got a beautiful, I believe that's a lateral malleolus wound. We've got a lateral hip wound here. We've got a plantar surface wound. We're using E-stim to help facilitate, and of course that would be a sacral ulcer. That's not a real butt, obviously, because, well, I hope you realize that. But this allows for stimulation. So there's going to be a current moving between these pads, right? That current is going to stimulate the wound bed to start helping stimulate that ADP and the ATP to flow in there, lay down some new collagen, and speed along the healing process. E-stim's not used as much as it used to be in wound care. Not exactly sure why, other than maybe it's just because of the supply costs. We tend to use just traditional wound care more frequently. But a lot of old school wound care therapists use E-stim quite efficiently. Dr. Kelly, who was one of our former anatomy instructors, he was a CWS certified wound care specialist. And he used E-stim a lot in his wound care treatments, just because we've seen a lot of good results with it. So final slide here. This is your quick stuff to remember. Well, when you have an anode, which is the positive pole, it is positive. It attracts, right, the anion. The cation is positive. It is attracted to the cathode, which is negative. Voltage is the electricity's potential. Amperes is the current. Ohms equals resistance. It's futile. You'll be assimilated. It's also known as the impedance. We have Ohm's law, which is I equals V over R. And then we have to remember that a series circuit, the total resistance is equal to the sum of the resistances, and the parallel circuit is the current is multiple paths. If I was a betting person when it comes to my quizzes and my tests, I would look at this slide here because I'm guessing there's probably a lot of information here that Mr. McKeever feels is, as I call it, VII. Very important information, right? That's why I made this slide for you. All right, so that sums it all up, actually. So that completes the eSTEM lecture. If there are any questions, please reach out to me. If not, I will hopefully see you guys again soon. Thank you very much for watching.